Tensions between the United States and Venezuela are increasing after the Obama administration declared Venezuela to be an extraordinary threat to national security and slapped sanctions on 7 top officials for alleged human rights violations and corruption. On Tuesday, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro asked the National Assembly for increased power to protect the country's integrity and sovereignty from what he described as, quote, imperialist aggression.
President Obama has decided to put himself into a box with no way out, a box of failure, and he has decided that he wants to be remembered in the future, like Richard Nixon and George W. Bush. President Obama will be remembered in the future for his decision today and the aggression against the Venezuelan people, the noble people, because the people of Venezuela are a peaceful people. President Obama, you don't have a right to attack us, nor to declare that Venezuela is a threat to the people of the United States. You are the threat to the people of the United States. You who decide to invade, to kill, to finance terrorism in the world.
At the State Department, spokesperson Jen Psaki defended the new sanctions against Venezuela.
There are specific reasons why each of those individuals under the executive order were sanctioned. The United States remains an important trading partner, is actually Venezuela's largest trading partner, and despite the statements to the contrary from Venezuelan officials, we are not promoting instability in Venezuela. Rather, we believe respect for democratic norms and human rights is the best guarantee of Venezuela's stability, hence our executive order. So allegations that these actions are an attempt to undermine the Venezuelan government are false. The goal of these sanctions is to persuade the government of Venezuela to change their behavior.
Tensions between the United States and Venezuela have been escalating for the past few months. In December, President Obama signed legislation to impose sanctions on Venezuelan government officials accused of violating protesters' rights during demonstrations last year when 43 people died, including demonstrators, government supporters, and security officials. On February 19th, the mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, was arrested for allegedly being involved in a U.S.-backed coup plot. Days later, Venezuela announced it had arrested an unspecified number of Americans for engaging in espionage and recruitment activities. Venezuela also announced a series of measures, including visa requirements for U.S. citizens and restrictions on the downsizing of the U.S. embassy in Caracas. This all comes as Venezuela is facing an economic crisis, in part because of the plummeting price of oil in recent months.
Well, for more, we go to Claremont, California, where we're joined by Miguel Salas. He is a professor at Pomona College in Claremont. Tinker Salas is the author of The Enduring Legacy, Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela, and the forthcoming book, Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. Miguel Tinker Salas, welcome back to Democracy Now! If you can start off by talking about the significance of President Obama declaring Venezuela to be an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States.
Well, I think it's a dramatic escalation and largely an unnecessary escalation of existing tensions between both countries. What is the objective of this? Is the objective here to appease the right in the U.S.?
Looks like the video is just frozen, but let us go from here. Professor Tinker Salas, go right ahead.
Yes. Well, I think that it's an unnecessary and a dramatic escalation of tensions between both countries. It comes on the heels of the fact that Obama in December of 2014 issued the sanctions. But those sanctions come after the House approved sanctions against Venezuela. So it's been an increase in tensions beginning since the time that Obama announced that he would begin to normalize relations with Cuba. So that on the one hand, we have an effort, theoretically, to normalize relations with Cuba while we maintain an embargo, and on the other hand, to create the image of Venezuela as the new Cuba, as the new country to be sanctioned. So in many ways, it's extremely counterproductive. On the one hand, we're expected to believe it responds to the interest of the U.S., particularly in terms of Obama in addressing the right in the U.S., but the reality is how it's read in Latin America is once again the U.S. And big stick diplomacy. It's read in terms of intervention. And the notion that the U.S. does not support coups is ludicrous on its face. And we we have the 2009 coup in Honduras, which you extensively covered, which was very clearly the U.S. was involved. The same thing with Lugo in Paraguay a couple of years later. So obviously the U.S. seeks to increase Venezuela's isolation, or to dramatically increase Venezuela's isolation, and continue a Bush policy of trying to inoculate Latin America from Venezuela, leading to essentially its own destabilization.
Well, Professor, you've made the comparison or the contrast, really, between U.S. government reaction to alleged human rights violations in Venezuela versus what is happening in Mexico. Could you talk about that?
Well, the U.S. policy falls apart when we talk about that precise example. In the case of Venezuela, the issue is made, and it's again a very condemnable act, the death of 43 people in Venezuela in February of last year during protests. All sides condemn the violence, but in that case, people died on both sides of the political spectrum. In fact, military officers and police were targeted by right-wing protesters. So those actions are condemnable, and again, they merit attention of Venezuela, and they should be prosecuted. But the reality is that in Mexico, 43 students disappeared in Ayotzinapa in the state of Guerrero, and hardly a peep from the U.S. It took weeks for the State Department to actually respond. So we have a duplicitous policy, on the one hand highlighting human rights issues in Venezuela, while on the other hand turning a blind eye to what is really a humanitarian crisis in Mexico, with over 80,000 dead, 40,000 disappeared, and 15 million people being expelled from their own country. So that in that sense, when Latin America looks at U.S. policy, it seems rather duplicitous, and in fact it doesn't hold up and increases the U.S. isolation in the region, particularly if we're considering that in April we're going to have the Summit of the Americas in Panama.
Last month, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said the United States is not interfering in Venezuela, but then said it's considering new actions to steer the Venezuelan government in a different direction.
The fact is the Venezuelan government should stop trying to blame the United States and other members of the international community for events inside Venezuela. The Venezuelan government actually needs to deal with the grave situation that it faces. The United States is not promoting unrest in Venezuela, nor are we attempting to undermine Venezuela's economy or its government. Well, I can tell you that the Treasury Department and the State Department are obviously closely monitoring this situation and are considering tools that may be available that could better steer the Venezuelan government in the direction that they believe they should be headed.
And I want to play for you a recent exchange between State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki and Matt Lee, a reporter with the Associated Press.
President Maduro last night went on the air and said that they had arrested multiple people who were allegedly behind a coup that was backed by the United States. What is your response?
These latest accusations, like all previous such accusations, are ludicrous. As a matter of long-standing policy, the United States does not support political transitions by non-constitutional means. Political transitions must be democratic, constitutional, peaceful, and legal. We've seen many times that the Venezuelan government tries to distract from its own actions by blaming the United States or other members of the international community for events inside Venezuela. These efforts reflect a lack of seriousness on the part of the Venezuelan government to deal with the grave situation it faces.
The U.S. has The U.S. has a long-standing practice of not promoting. What did you say? How long-standing is that? I would. In particular, in South and Latin America, that is not a long-standing practice.
Well, my point here, Matt, without getting into history, is that we do not support, we have no involvement with, and these are ludicrous accusations.
In this specific case.
Correct.
But if you go back not that long ago, during your lifetime, even. This is
The
not
last
that
21
long
years?
Well done. Touche. But, I mean, look, I don't know. Does long-standing mean 10 years in this case? I mean, what
Matt, my intention was to speak to the specific reports.
But you said it's a long-standing U.S. practice, and I'm not so sure how. It depends on what your definition of long-standing is.
Okay.
Very recently in Kiev, whatever we say about Ukraine, whatever, the change of government in the beginning of last year was unconstitutional. And you supported it. The Constitution was not constitutional.
And that was State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki being questioned by reporters. Professor Miguel Tinker Salas, if you could respond to both that exchange and also Josh Earnest, State Department White House spokesperson.
I would have loved if that kind of exchange would have got broader diffusion in the U.S. press, but the fact is that it hasn't, and we continue to have the belief that the U.S. is not involved in unconstitutional change in Latin America. And as a historian, the record speaks just the opposite, from 53 in Guatemala to the Dominican Republic to Chile in 73, and through the support of the Argentine military dictatorships in Brazil, and if we want to go even closer to 2002 in Venezuela, when the U.S. actually did support a coup against the democratically elected Hugo Chavez, the shortest coup in the world and the coup that brought Chavez back to power. And then again in Honduras in 2009, and not shortly thereafter in Paraguay with Lugo, where they said it was a democratic transition when in fact it was an unconstitutional shift in power. So again, the notion that the U.S. has not supported both military coups directly or through what they call soft power is really ludicrous. And in fact, we should turn the question around. If they want to support democracy, I think the best thing the U.S. can do in the case of Venezuela and other countries is to pull back and let things develop on their own. I think you have a very strong opposition in Venezuela. It can speak for itself. You have a government force and other social forces that are organized in those countries. And I think the best thing in the case of Mexico and in the case of Venezuela is for the U.S. to stop intervening and to allow these countries to resolve their own.
We're talking to Professor Miguel Tinker Salas, having a little trouble with the video, but keep on going with the with our connection to him over at Pomona College in Claremont. You're back, Professor Tinker Salas.
Thank you very much. Well, I think fundamentally, there are fundamental economic issues in Venezuela which the government has to address. But the reality is that by the U.S. intervening in this way, and let's be clear, the effort to sanction individuals is an intervention in Venezuela, and it's not going to be read as simply the sanction against 7 individuals. It's going to be read as a sanction against Venezuela and the government of Venezuela and the country of Venezuela, and that's unfortunate because it detracts attention from the real economic issues. And the government is responsible for those issues, and it's been slow to act. But in many ways, this will now provide the context for what will happen at the Summit of the Americas, where the U.S. had expected that it was going to arrive and be celebrated for having opened up relations with Cuba. But now even Cuba is criticizing the U.S. and saying they will not be a part of any effort on the part of the U.S. to isolate Venezuela. And that seems to have been the strategy: open up with Cuba while at the same time isolating Venezuela and making Venezuela appear as the bad boy of the left in Latin America. And I think that policy failed under Bush, and it's failed under Obama as well.
Well, but Professor Tinker Salas, what about all of the reports we're seeing in the commercial media here in the United States about the increasing crisis in Venezuela? What's your assessment of how President Maduro has functioned since he succeeded to the presidency after the death of President Chavez? And what about these issues of increasing economic spiraling inflation and economic problems in the country?
No doubt. I think President Maduro has been very slow in responding to the crisis. I think that effort to retain an unworkable exchange rate, 3 different exchange rates, and protect the Venezuelan Bolivar was untenable. I think that they took way too long to respond to that process. I think that may have exacerbated the crisis. There have been steps taken recently to let the Venezuelan Bolivar float, to actually normalize that process. They should be able to provide greater and greater access to dollars. Venezuela it imports most of what it consumes. That's been the sad reality since 1935, when Venezuela became the world's second largest exporter of oil, and then became the world's first largest exporter of oil. And that happens to be part of the culture and society of Venezuela. Many Venezuelans have been raised with the notion that they're a privileged country, that therefore they're entitled to a set of benefits, from the cheapest gasoline in the world to subsidized food prices. And this government has been slow to respond to that. And with a drop in price of oil, that model became largely untenable. And I think that the government has not taken sufficient steps. It has acknowledged corruption. It has acknowledged bottlenecks in the distribution. It has acknowledged inefficiency. It has to address those issues. And Venezuelans need to hold them accountable to those issues. That's why, in many ways, the U.S. issue becomes a distraction, because as the U.S. intervenes in this context, it simply becomes a side issue in what is largely an economic internal matter.
Earlier this month, Venezuelans marked the 2nd anniversary of the death of President Hugo Chavez. This is Domingo Robledo, who is president of the Sinai Communal Council.
Siento el mismo dolor que sentí hace 2 años. ¿Me entiende?
I feel the same pain I felt 2 years ago. Talking about Chavez is like talking about the loss of a father, and we truly feel like this because today we have a working-class president, a revolutionary, a socialist, and many of us have made the error of saying that Maduro is not Chavez. However, it's totally the opposite because everyone says we are Chavez.
Venezuelan opposition member Maria Corina Machado also commented on the death of Hugo Chavez.
We are reaping what was sown during Hugo Chavez's mandate, the destruction of the productive capacity of the country, of institutions and its independence, including the confrontation and polarization of society as state policy.
Professor Tinker Salas, if you could respond and also comment on whether the U.S. would be taking this tack in dealing with Venezuela if it didn't have oil.
No, I think fundamentally that Venezuela has the world's largest reserves on oil. And I think oil, I've always said, follow the oil, and you will be able to understand what is happening in Venezuela, what is happening between Venezuela and the U.S., what is happening between Venezuela and the rest of the world. So I think that's fundamental. I think that the figure of Hugo Chavez is still the most powerful political figure in Venezuela. He represents a watershed in Venezuelan history, contrary to what Maria Corina Machado has indicated. Nonetheless, I think there is some truth to the fact that what Venezuela faces today is some of the excesses that occurred during the Chavez period and some of the issues that weren't fully resolved during the Chavez period, and that is the dependence on oil, that is a non-functioning exchange rate, and that is the dramatic growth without, at the same time, a parallel growth in productive capacity within the country. Those remain some of the challenges the country faces, and it highlights the dependence that many third world countries have on export products, particularly one as strategic as oil.
And what about the, since the death of Chavez, the impact on all of the regional alliances that Chavez sought to create, not only low-cost oil to other countries in Latin America, but new economic unions of the South in terms of promoting economic integration? What's happened there?
Well, I think that we're talking about the community of Latin American and Caribbean nations, the CELAC, UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. We're talking about the Bolivian Alliance for the Americas. I think those are now institutionalized at many levels. But undoubtedly, the impact of the absence of Chavez has been felt. There is a vacuum of leadership in the region, one that has yet to be filled directly. Or maybe we shouldn't expect it to be filled in much the same way. Increasingly, we have a collective leadership. We have the voices of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. We have the voices of Evo Morales in Bolivia, Correa in Ecuador. We have multiple voices that are evident here, but it's also clear that they have been under attack. The U.S.'s resolution on sanctions on Venezuela, I think, seeks to promote fissures within those alliances. We've seen Biden traveling to the Caribbean, Biden traveling to Central America, trying to find fissures in the other institution, which was Petrocaribe. So I think that they have been under difficult conditions. I think that they have been tested. I think the U.S. is looking for fissures within those alliances by promoting the Pacific Alliance of nations that have bilateral trade relations with the U.S. and by promoting the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I think that that looms large now in the context of the drop in oil prices and the drop of other export products. So the U.S. is clearly strategically testing that relationship, and we're going to see how that carries out with the Summit of the Americas in April in Panama.
Is there any relationship between what's happening, the U.S. approach to what's happening in Venezuela, and the U.S. involvement in the negotiations with Iran right now?
I don't see necessarily a direct link, but I see some continuation in how these relations have been, in fact, linked and coupled in the U.S., and that is that the U.S. is increasingly, the Obama administration is taking a more right tack, particularly as it negotiates with Iran towards Venezuela, and the same way as it negotiates with Cuba, it takes more of a right tack in dealing with Venezuela. So while it tries to cover its right flank in the U.S., while it negotiates with Cuba and it negotiates with Iran.
Miguel Tinker Salas, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Professor at Pomona College in Claremont, California, author of The Enduring Legacy, Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela. We look forward to your next book, Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian Eric Foner joins us to talk about the Underground Railroad. Stay with us.